Hello everybody, Carl Larson here with another After Effects tutorial for you. A couple weeks ago, there was a question on the forums about how to create a whip pan effect similar to what you might see in camera when an operator rapidly moves from one subject to another. But they wanted to do it as a transition between two separate clips and link them into one believable move. And they wanted to do it without the use of any third-party plugins. So after mulling it over for a while and coming up with the most ridiculously complicated solution, using expressions and sliders and a whole bunch of other junk, I thought I'd dedicate this episode of the podcast to answering that question in the simplest way I know how. And all that it requires is a couple of keyframes and a tiny bit of math. Besides, we're all visual people here, and sometimes it's a whole lot easier to see the explanation than to try to read or write one. So in this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to create a whip pan effect using After Effects built-in tools. To create a whip pan, we'll need two clips in our composition. One is the outgoing clip and one is the incoming clip. So let's take both of our QuickTime movies here in the project window and drop them on the Make New Comp button. When we do this, we're presented with the New Composition from Selection dialog box. We'll create a single composition, choose the dimensions from either clip. They're both the same size, so it doesn't matter. And choose to sequence our layers. Sequencing the layers means that After Effects will automatically put the beginning of the second clip at the end of the first clip for us. Which isn't too big of a deal in our case, but it's a real time saver if we're dropping 50 stills into a composition for a slideshow or something like that. Additionally, if we choose overlap, we can specify a duration and transition between the layers as well. So let's do that. Choose a duration of 10 frames and select Dissolve the Front Layer for our transition. So now scrubbing through the comp, you can see that we have two layers with a dissolve. Nothing too fancy yet. Now with both layers selected, press P to reveal the position properties of the layers, and then Shift U to reveal the opacity keyframes used in the transition. Now at the endpoint of the incoming clip, set a position keyframe for the outgoing clip. This will keep the outgoing layer in place until the transition begins. Similarly, go to the end of the outgoing clip and set a keyframe for the position of the incoming clip. This will set the final position of the incoming layer so that it lands in the right place at the end of the transition. But now I need to do something about getting the layers to whip across the screen. If I go partway through the transition and grab the outgoing layer to move it off screen, we run into an obvious problem. I run out of footage on the borders of the layer. So we'll need to expand this out. To do this, go to Effect, Stylize, Motion Tile, and change the output width of the effect to 300. Now if we move the layer around horizontally, we can see that we've expanded the borders to the left and right of the layer. Choosing a value of 300 gives us an output width 3 times the original size of the layer. So we get a full copy of itself on the left and a full copy of itself on the right. At this point, let me set a quick expression for the opacity of the outgoing layer to temporarily override the dissolve so that we can see what we're doing a little more clearly. Option or Alt clicking on the stopwatch for the opacity, type 100 to temporarily lock out the opacity value to 100%. To deactivate this expression later, simply click on the equals sign. That's the Enable Expression button below the opacity value. Now with the opacity set to 100%, it's easy to tell we have very abrupt edges. To fix this, check the Mirror Edges box in the Motion Tile effect, and we get a mirrored copy of the layer on the left and right edges of the frame. This will give us a much smoother result for a whip pan. Let's do the same thing for the vertical height and set it to a value of 300. Moving the layer around again, we can see we now effectively have 9 full copies of the layer in the composition window, which means we have enough border on the layer that we can freely move it around in whichever direction we'd like for the transition. Pressing E on the keyboard to reveal the effects on the outgoing layer, let's copy the Motion Tile effect, Command-C or Control-C, and paste it onto the incoming layer, Command or Control-V. Now both layers have the Motion Tile effect applied with the same settings. This gives both of them a large enough border that their edges will overlap for the entire transition. Now one of the tricks to making this transition work convincingly is that the incoming and outgoing layers have to move the exact same distance but in opposite directions for the duration of the effect. And secondly, if you're working with actual footage that has motion in it versus a still, it's important to choose a transition direction that works with what the recorded motion of the camera is already doing. And since both of these shots are panning from left to right, it would make sense that we'd have the transition go from right to left. That means the yellow leaf footage, our outgoing layer, needs to move to the left-hand side of the comp during the transition. So instead of grabbing the layer in the composition window, or freely scrubbing the position values in the timeline, I've found the easiest way to set things up accurately is to do some basic addition and subtraction right in the timeline. So for example, since I know I want the yellow footage to move 1 full comp width to the left, I know it has to move exactly 1920 pixels from its current position. So instead of trying to do the math in my head and figure out what that value is, I'll simply edit the x-axis value for the layer, deselect the highlighted text, and type in minus 1920 after the value that's already in the box. And that'll do it. If I wanted to move it to the right, I'd do the same thing, but type plus 1920 instead. Now for the incoming layer, I'll do the same thing to set the beginning value's keyframe, but in the opposite direction. I'll also change the expression for the opacity on the outgoing layer to 0, just so I can see what's going on. With that out of the way, I'll edit the x-axis value and type in the opposite of what I did on the outgoing layer. So the x-axis value plus 1920 pixels. Obviously, if the composition were a different size, say dV, you'd change this value to whatever is appropriate for your composition. And now that this is set up, let's deactivate the opacity expression on the outgoing layer to reactivate the dissolve, and see what we have. Looks pretty good. At the beginning of the transition, my incoming layer is 1920 pixels to the right, while the outgoing layer is in the middle of the composition. And at the end of the transition, the incoming layer is in the middle of the composition, and the outgoing layer is shifted 1920 pixels to the left. But a horizontal whip pan isn't the most exciting thing in the world, so we can change the angle of the transition by modifying the position values on the y-axis as well. So on the last keyframe of the outgoing layer, let's add 500 pixels to the y-axis value. And on the incoming layer, let's subtract 500 pixels. Great. Now there's only one small problem. It doesn't exactly whip. It's still just a fancy dissolve. To change this, all we need to do is activate the motion blur switches for both the layers and then turn on the global motion blur switch in the composition. Now let's take another RAM preview of the transition. Very nice. If you want to modify the amount of blur in the effect, you can either reduce the overall motion that the layers travel, or you can modify the motion blur settings in the composition. To change the motion blur settings, go to Composition, Composition Settings, and click on the Advanced tab to change the shutter angle. The higher the value, the more blur you'll see. The lower the value, the less blur you'll see. Typically, most film or HD cameras operate somewhere around 180-degree shutter, and many consumer cameras operate at 360-degree shutter. Choose what works best for you, and what best matches your footage or the effect that you're going for. As a final means of cleaning things up, let's select the position keyframes and press F9 to add easy ease interpolation to the motion. As a means of speeding up render time, you may want to go just a little bit ahead of the transition, split the layer, Command-Shift-D, and remove the motion tile effect from the incoming layer until the transition point. Similarly, we can do the same thing at the end of the transition. Go a little bit beyond it, split the layer, and then turn off or remove the motion tile effect. There's no need to calculate the motion tile effect if we're not moving the layer. Well, there you have it, a rather simple solution for a pretty cool effect. You just need a couple keyframes and a tiny bit of math. So until next time, I'm Carl Larson for CreativeCow.net.